Okay, guys, welcome to the Learning Letterpress, and I am so happy to introduce our guest today, Michael Sharp. Michael lives in Utah, and he is a multidisciplinary artist doing printmaking, book arts, and photography. He's going to tell us about all things ink today, which I'm so excited about. He has a MFA, from BYU. He did a residency at J. Willard Library Book Arts Program, and the College Art and Design Book Arts Master's Program was integral to his development. So I'm happy to introduce you to Michael.
Thank you, Dory. Thank you all for coming to listen to my me talk. So I guess I'll give kind of a background of how I got interested in ink. It was obviously through Letterpress, but I was kind of a TA shop assistant not at the Corcoran, at another shop, where we were using this ink and it just was soupy and weak, and I didn't know what was going on. I was just like, what is up with this ink? I just kept asking that question, and finally I just said, okay, that's it. I'm gonna start looking into ink and what it should be. And being me, I started looking at books kind of about letterpress, about printing, and from print history. So if you look at the bibliography, a lot of these books are, 1800s, early 1900s, not so much today. And as I've been reading about ink and researching ink, I've noticed a few trends. Something that happens it starts out pretty simple. It's all chemistry, but as you go along, by 1940, it's chemistry, and it's chemical industries, right, and coatings industries. And it starts to get more chemical and technical, and there's more and more patents being made and granted for printing ink, and that continues on today, where we see more of it being more about chemistry than about, well, I mean, it's still about ink, but the focus, if you want to read about ink, you have to go to chemistry books and coatings industry books rather than books about ink for the real technical stuff. Another thing that you see is a trend. If you're looking for letterpress ink specifically, by the 1960s, 70s, you start to see less and less written about it because it's falling out of fashion. Offset litho is rising up and taking its place and replacing letterpress printing. And so you get less information specifically about that type of ink. So that's why they're all old books. Maybe it's outdated, but I think it still has a lot of information that, because the properties of ink haven't changed, the language, the terminology, it's still all the same. Looking at that. So what is ink? Hopefully you're all familiar a little bit with what ink is, or at least you've held a can of ink or a tube maybe, if you're doing more smaller printing, right? And you maybe even put ink on a press. I don't know. I know we've got some really long-time printers here and also some newer printers with us and watching, but it's at its basic definition, it's a pigment in a binder, which that's the same thing as paint, right? And you could compare it to oil paint. If any of you are oil painters, you might recognize some of the terms quite well. So there's different vehicles. That's the binder that they use to mix the pigment into, right? I think you're familiar with probably the two main ones that we have today are oil-based and rubber-based. There's also polyacrylic, which I've used. It's just fine. They're all great, right? There's also, you can also do a solvent base, but for the type of printing we're doing, you probably shouldn't be running a solvent base because they're too too thin typically, but like a news press or web offset press, those are going to be more solvent based. You hear about presses, the ink flying and misting, printers needing to wear hats. That's the kind of ink they were using, that thin ink.
Michael, can we take a quick pause and just do
Yeah,
a survey and see kind of who is using what kind of ink?
that would be great.
Interesting.
I'd love that.
If you use regularly, if you use like a rubber-based ink, would you let us know? You can just unmute yourself real quick and say, hey, I use rubber-based. So if that's your primary ink medium.
I'm going to say no.
About 10% of the time I use rubber-based, and the rest is oil-based that I've picked up here and there.
Right.
Okay. Anybody
Picked
else?
up here and there.
Yeah.
That's about all I have.
So who's using an oil-based ink primarily? I see Christopher and Phil.
I've been using oil-based ink exclusively for probably 15 years or more. That primarily comes from the palette because it's fluorescent and metallic that I work with, so it's exclusively oil-based, so it kind of just led me that way. But then I've always found a better level of saturation with it in terms of not getting a salty sort of look like you get occasionally from rubber-based ink and other things. So I do
That's
sort
interesting.
of prefer it in terms of texture and in terms of how it behaves on the page as well.
Right.
Yeah. Is anybody using a solvent-based ink primarily?
Okay, Solly. Put your
Probably not. What about polyacrylic?
So I'm using a soy-based ink. I know you hadn't quite mentioned that.
We'll get into that.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that. But Christopher, your comments about sort of the properties of how your ink is laying on the page and especially the color availability, I think is really interesting because I'm finding some limitations.
Yeah, I've found that with rubber base and acrylic inks, I've only used acrylic black, but when you try to get a large color field on any sort of cotton-based paper, not only because of fibrousness of the paper, but just because the natural tendency of the ink not to saturate the page, you end up with a salty kind of texture. It's just always going to happen. I've never really found a workaround for it except for going to an oil-based ink. And as soon as I did, it'll tend to saturate the fibers, help them lay down, you know. And then I'm sure you all know too, based on the tackiness of the ink, they can run into the same problems with drawing the fibers off the page, and then you get that same sort of saltiness, but they feel like different problems to me. So
yeah,
I've had a lot of success with
are
large color fields with oil-based ink.
Yeah, that's cool.
Is there any type of tack reducer for rubber base?
You could probably add kerosene, just a drop or two of kerosene.
I'm not sure how long that would last on the press before it evaporated off and you were back to the same thing. But
if it's mixed in well, it might hold up longer. But you're right.
I've used lacquer before.
Yeah.
Just like you would with oil-based ink, and you tend to get a little bit more time out of it, but that's only, on short runs. So.
Right. That's probably mostly what I'll be talking about today is short runs. And I know the most about oil-based inks and how they function. So we'll mostly talk about oil. But all the properties go across all the different inks. They're still relevant. And some of the things that Chris has brought up, I think we'll mention why those things are happening once we delve into the properties. Should we continue forward with that?
Yeah, all good. Thanks for your input, guys.
Yeah, those are great. So I mean, there's different oils you can use. There's the naturally drying oils, that's linseed oil, tung oil. Those are basically the two main ones. They can be expensive, so often they'll cut that with another dry oil that's maybe a semi-drying oil. like cottonseed or rapeseed. There's also non-drying oils, and those aren't used as often in an oil that needs to dry. Some of the solvent set ones will use those sometimes because the solvent can suck the oil out, so it will dry. But for the most part, animal oils, mineral oils don't dry. Olive oil doesn't dry, right?
So don't
Peanut
go
oil,
to the pantry.
castor oil,
Okay.
those are non-drying oils, the ones you're probably using in the kitchen. Although you can still use those to soften up your ink if you needed to. There's an issue with there's two issues, right? Anytime you mix something into an ink, you're cutting down the proportion of the pigment that's in there, unless you're adding more pigment. And then another thing is, if it's not mixed thoroughly and it's not going to dry, it can leach out eventually. You see that sometimes with older stuff. If the pigment and binder haven't been mixed fully, they'll separate and you'll get yellow staining kind of on the back and in the paper. Hopefully no one's giving you that these days. So once you've got those oils, they have to be bodied. They've got to be thickened up to work for letterpress and for printing, for all printing. So they do that by, back in the olden days, I haven't researched all the way back to Gutenberg, only to Moxon and his mechanic exercises from 1683, right? Some of you are probably very familiar with that book, but one thing he really talks about is the varnish and the oil and how it's prepared. And he kind of poo-poos British ink makers for their lack of good preparation and praises the Dutch, kind of calls it the Dutch method, where they're really taking the time to body the oil and use appropriate dryers. So you've got your double aught. I use burnt plate oil. You can also use litho varnish. It's really just runny. And then it goes up in grades. Like I use a lot of number 3 for letterpress ink that I make. Not that I make like super amazing ink, but it's something that I've had fun doing. It's been fun for me to be able to use pigments that really can't find or get from other ink makers.
Michael, what's the property that you're seeking by using the number 3, and how do I'm assuming the other numbers vary. Can you kind of walk through what maybe that variation?
Yeah. I mean, one thing with a thinner ink, it's going to be longer. It's going to be runnier. It's going to have less body, so it's going to have a tendency to be thin, right? So if you wanted a thicker, stiffer ink, you would use a higher number of oil that's been bodied longer, thicker oil. And
so I've noticed when my ink is too thin, it will pool in the corners of my type or my and it just it is in a weird way that I notice. So my lines aren't as crisp. But whenever I get the right body in ink, I can accomplish those nice crisp lines I'm looking for. Is that similar to your experience?
Yeah, that's a good example. It can be kind of messy, and you can end up also needing. It's kind of sloppy. You can find it kind of beating up too, purling, and separating. So let's talk a little bit about thicker ink. So thicker ink will be crisper. It'll hold its shape and body better. If it's too thick, it's not going to roll up, right? It's not going to, and it's even going to have too much tack probably, and not going to want to transfer completely. And that's where you get picking, is when it doesn't want to separate. So ink, if you think about it, ink splits. It always splits. You're always splitting a film. So when you're pulling it off the ink disc or out of the ink train, every roller, every time it comes into contact with the surface, it's pulling the ink apart. When you pick it up on your brayer or your rollers, it's pulling it apart. And then when you put it on the type and lay it down, you're pulling it apart again. And then again, another layer. When you pull it from the type to the paper, it splits it once again. So tack is its resistance to want to split. That's the definition of tack. Other things that affect it is how long it is. So long ink isn't going to want to break as soon. So it'll stretch out longer before that thread snaps, right? So with letterpress, typically you want a pretty short ink, really short ink. Most books I've read say as stiff as possible with it still being able to strip from the paper, right? Strip the form. That's when the form pulls away from the paper, and without picking, which is what Chris mentioned, that ink pulling the fibers of the paper rather than the paper pulling it and releasing it from the type. So you typically want a pretty stiff ink. Litho is interesting. And I think some of us end up using litho ink sometimes. It's got a lot of additives to maintain that water oil balance that it has to do, but it also tends to be a little longer because so that it doesn't break as easily and emulsify. So that's something to be aware of if you're using litho inks. They will probably tend to be a little longer. There's things you can add to shorten ink. Best way to shorten an ink is to add pigment. That's a direct quote from one of those books. And it is, because what you end up doing is you're giving it more body by giving it more of that pigment, dry pigment. So that could also represent, if you're needing to add pigment and stiffen up your ink, it's possible that the ink was manufactured with the minimum amount of pigment that they felt it needed, and it's come across as a little weak. So weak ink would be one that doesn't have enough pigment in it, and therefore not enough body, also not enough color when you mix it up. And I've seen some ink that I thought was kind of weak and needed more color, more pigment to body it up, just to body it up, really. Should we talk more about pigments? Ink making's pretty complex. Like Chris said, he uses a lot of those fluorescents and metallics. Each pigment that they use has its own specific properties. It will grind to a certain particle size. Particle size will affect how it lays, how crisp your lines are. Also how it will affect drying. Some pigments are naturally increase drying. Like iron oxides do that. They help with that. Magnesium definitely does. So you can do that too. I think there's probably enough dryer in most inks these days, just because of commercial need for that. Like an ink, I see sometimes we see the question of can you stack your prints? And you definitely can. So most of the inks today that we see they have what's called a top-down dryer. So that promotes drying on the surface of the ink. As soon as it's transferred to the paper, that surface begins to, if you're using oil-based, it begins to oxidize, right? And dry up and set up pretty much immediately. And if you're using rubber-based, it's drying more by absorption, right? But releasing down in. So it's pulling down in and leaving that surface dry in theory as well. They also add anti-set-off agents, anti-scratch agents sometimes too. So you can add rosins, and that will help with scratch resistance. Waxes help with anti-offset. Waxes will also soften up your ink. If you needed to reduce tack, you could add a wax or a waxy substance. I hesitate to say Vaseline, but that would soften your ink up. Rosins tend to be harder or dry harder, and also they'll add gloss if you add those. There's natural and synthetic oils and waxes. Rosins, oils, and waxes, all of it, right? You can get natural versions, and those were used for, into the 1900s, up until, 20s, 30s even. They were still using just these traditional processes of extruding a natural oil, probably linseed oil. They say tongue is better, but also much more expensive. Economy drives a lot of industry and what we get in a lot of ways.
Michael, while you're pausing and kind of a thought, I don't know if you plan to talk about it, and it's okay if it's later, but do you have, for folks that might be interested in exploring mixing their own inks, do you have a favorite place where you pick up the pigment, for example, or a provider that you might recommend that people interested in starting this process could look at?
Yeah, I would probably recommend Kramer Pigments. If you're not familiar with them, you can look them up on their website. It's Kremer,
Okay.
Kramer Pigments. They're a reliable source. I don't know how their pricing compares to others. There used to be Guerra. I'm not sure if they're still in business or not in New York. Kramer's based in New York City, but they do ship everywhere. I bought my linseed oil through Daniel Smith. Because they're doing oil paint still. They used to have their whole ink line, and he used to do ink for everything, but artist pigments, right? But I think that you can still get oil through them, or Graphic Chemical. Sometimes you have to wait a little bit for them to ship, but they should still have all these things available. So you would want to look for a burnt plate oil or a litho varnish. And litho varnish is interesting because litho varnish specifically shouldn't have any additives. It should just be a bodied linseed oil.
Okay.
Varnish is often used as a term to define that oil plus additives. So like plus your dryers, your rosins and waxes if there's any in there. But mainly that drying oil, right? So I would recommend for letterpress, there's other things that affect how thick you want your ink, like your press type. They say cylinder presses actually can handle a longer ink than platen presses. So if you're running a Vandercook, you probably could get away with a longer ink than if you're running a Chandler and Price. But it's got to be able to move through your fountain. So if you're running a Heidelberg, like a windmill, well, let's talk about windmills, but cylinders too. You've got to get that ink to flow through your fountain, and if it's too stiff, it's not going to. But then the speed on the press, if it's going faster, you kind of need a thinner ink so that it can move that fast and handle going that fast. Otherwise, it's just gonna fall apart, right? But if you're just doing platen press work, I'd probably get like a double aught oil, a thin oil, and then a medium, like a number 3. And you can wet out your pigment with the thin oil. just a little bit, just to get into a paste. And actually, Kramer has pigment pastes. You could buy one of those and then mix it with the bodied oil that you want. You will have to add dryer. Linseed oil dries on its own, right? It will dry, but it'll take you, I mean, depending on the heat and the humidity, temperature and humidity, it could take like 2 or 3 weeks to dry.
Ooh, okay,
So,
that's a long dry time for Houston.
So yeah. So
I don't think that works for me.
If you have room in your loft to just let those prints hang for a month, you know, before you print the other side, or if you need to lay down more colors or something, you know, that's fine. But you want to add dryer. The dryers they're heavy metals. Cobalt especially is toxic, so you want to be careful with that. You really only need a drop or 2 per pound. But cobalt dryer is going to be a top-down dryer, so it's going to promote surface drying. And then manganese is going to be another dryer that you're going to want to add in probably, because it's called a through dryer, so it kind of dries evenly throughout the whole film. So if you had what's called a two-way dryer, some of you might know what that is, but basically it's a cobalt manganese mix where you've got something that's drying, promoting oxidation and polymerization from the surface, but also within to dry it up quick. You know, commercial inks dry within what, 2 to 4 hours, something like that. Set immediately and then dry within 2 to 4 hours so that you can get the other side printed within a shift, right, and get it out the door. There's other things they can do with commercial inks. They can actually add like a little bit of a solvent that thins it out just enough to where it flows great, but then once it's on the paper, that solvent absorbs in and leaves a denser, thicker, not thicker, but what's the right word? That film, right? That's not as thin.
And joined by.
What's that?
I think we had someone who
Okay.
their household. Yeah, that wasn't on mute. So you're
Okay. Should we? Let's talk about blacks, whites, and metallics for just a minute. So there's different black. Where does black come from? It's typically a carbon, which actually isn't considered natural because it goes through a chemical process. Typically you're burning. With a lamp black, it's going to be peat or oil that's burned, and then they collect the carbon pigment from it. I was going to say soot, but soot actually has more than just the carbon in it. It's got a little like unburned particles and stuff. But they do that, and nowadays they collect it on a cold plate that's above the flame. It hits it, carbonizes, and then they just scrape that off. You'll see some people using cups. That can work too. Or they used to use what's called a sac noir. There's this big chimney, tall chimney lined with sheepskin, sheep wool, to catch the carbon particles. And the higher up you go, right, the finer the grade of carbon pigment you'd have, the smaller particle you'd have. Those have been used for a long time, carbon blacks. One thing to note, often a pigment particle size should be around 5 micron. So they need to be pretty small. And you have trouble getting a lot of the natural earth pigments down to that size, particle size. That's why they tend to be harder to work with for printing ink. Certainly less so than where in a chemistry lab they can mix and combine and create precipitates that really any color that you want or need, right? And if they can't produce it, there's something called a lake pigment. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term, lake pigment or lake. In oil paints, you'll see it a lot. And what that is they use a white pigment base, usually like maybe aluminum hydrate or a barytia. I always pronounce that word incorrectly, apparently. Barytia particle that then they dye, and they put that in the dye, and it dyes the particles, and then they use that as a pigment. Of course, you know, carbon, iron oxides, natural pigments, they're the most light, fast, and permanent pigments. Dyes tend to be a little fugitive, but at the same time, if you go back to when the aniline dyes were first discovered, and I don't know if you're all familiar with this, but aniline dyes were originally distillate, a coal distillate, so a product of processing and really chemically dissecting coal, right? And they came up with these beautiful reds and purples that they really couldn't get before. And now we have them. I think they've got other methods to use too for those. But if you can control that, if you can control with a dye and dye your pigment, have it absolutely consistent compared to just like what's the geological makeup of this lapis lazuli we have today, you know, it's more consistent for not just the manufacturer but also for the printer who uses it. And then also if you're using those dyed bases, it's easier to control their properties because you have an idea of those, right? They don't change from red to green to blue. They're all consistent, and you can manage your oil better that way if you're making ink. Questions? Should I keep talking?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. I'm trying to see where are we at. Oh, so whites. We have something called opaque and transparent often. The transparent white that we use, I think, is curious. I wonder if we shouldn't be using more of just a higher grade of litho varnish, like maybe a body ink gum. The higher numbers, like 7 and 8, 6 sometimes even, are considered body ink gums because you can add those to add body to your ink. But in the opaque, you know, they used to use lead white, right? I think you're all familiar with why they don't anymore. It's bad for you. It's toxic. So they stopped using lead white so much. Although lead's interesting because it promotes drying, and they actually used to take lead white, lead oxide, litharge, and put it in the oil while it was boiling, and that was what they were using for a dryer, was that lead white, and just dumping it in while it was boiling to mix it in and get it in the oil, get it reacting and bodying so that it could dry. But nowadays we're using other dryers, paste and Japan dryers, and but so back to white. So titanium white has better covering power than lead white. Anyway, it's a nice bright. Zinc is often used, zinc white, and those are really not toxic compared to lead. And what else? Magnesium. Some of you add mag sometimes. But then there's also some pigments that are transparent because they just don't have any color power, like calcium carbonate, the barytes, right? They really don't have a coloring power. So once you add that dye onto them, then it gives them more efficacy, I guess, as a pigment to add color. Where are we? Metallics. Metallics are a whole, but as Chris mentioned, metallics are a whole nother thing. They're a whole nother system. As far as pigments go, they're pretty large because they're really metal flakes, thin metal flakes. They used to use brass and aluminum. Nowadays, it's mostly just aluminum. Brass is kind of expensive, and then they tint the oil, and so that you get those different shades. in those metallics. So they're kind of all the same thing, but they do have to use, I think, are they exclusively using oil? I think you could do some other systems with them, but I think they're pretty much exclusively oil. Because they can add those dryers, right, and the oxidation. The aluminum itself actually inhibits drying. But you can, you can chemically body oil, and you can chemically change the ink in ways to where it will do whatever you want it to. If you're a chemist.
I could be wrong, but I think
I
think my gold one is a rubber based, if I'm not mistaken.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's the Van Sun gold.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure
it could be
based. Yeah.
Great. Did we talk about rubber bases, how they're working?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I think it would be great to talk about kind of the differences between maybe an oil and a rubber, since those are the two most common. So what the difference in properties are.
Right. So just talking off of the two products that we see today, right now, rubber is going to be what's called a quick set. Also, what do they call that when it doesn't dry on press?
Where it stays open longer?
Yeah, a stay open, thank you. Stay open ink, quick set ink. So it's going to stay open on the press because it dries by absorption. And it can't, so what's happening with drying by absorption is that instead of interacting with the air outside, the ink is interacting with the paper and the substrate. So it's using the paper to either pull like a bit of a solvent out, or pull parts of that ink in and separate them out so that drying action can start to catalyze and start to take place and polymerize the ink. We see today that they're typically stiffer. You wouldn't have to make a stiff rubber-based ink. You could take that rubber base and actually, mix it and manage it in the same ways you could oil, making it thinner or thicker, or adding more or less pigment to give it more or less body, also more or less covering power. But the product we seem to see today is that the rubber base is a little stiffer, a little heavier, and I'm going to say a little tackier too.
I would say I've noticed all of those properties with the rubber that I'm using, the couple. So
right, but you could make an oil-based ink that is just as stiff and just as tacky as that rubber base. But I think we've seen a product diversification where it's like, okay, well, we'll just make the rubber base this way, these properties, oil base this way with these properties, and hopefully that'll cover everything, right? I'm not convinced that it covers everything. When you look back, even just to the 60s, they were making ink, specifically letterpress, not just letterpress ink, but letterpress ink for a specific press, like a job press, a cylinder press, technically news presses, web, those would fall under typographic printing. Totally different ink though. But then also they would break it down by paper type. So you'd have like bond, ledger, antique or coated. You'd have a halftone black. You'd have a book black. And they all need a little bit different properties, right? So like a book black typically doesn't have as much shine or gloss, so that then when you're looking at the book, nowadays you buy a book and you read it and you'll see like the letters all turn white because of reflection. You typically wouldn't want that in a book black. Also, they were designed to work with the antique papers that were used for books then. And say like a halftone black, I always thought a halftone black should be shorter and stiffer, so that it would, so it wouldn't run over all those little tiny dots as much. But if you make it stiffer, I mean, a halftone is actually a very dense cluster of detail, right? So with that density, it has to be a little softer or it won't strip without picking. And they knew that, and it was based off of those paper properties and types. How stiff can we get that ink before it will actually pull this paper apart, right? So they could adjust that. And we don't have access to that today so much. Maybe some of you do and are working with your ink makers to get more than just letterpress ink. That's great.
Yeah,
if you are.
We run a big mealy press at the Minnesota State Fair, and
Yeah.
for the ink we run in there, it is almost soupy.
Yeah.
And you run it real thin on the rollers, but yeah, really thin ink. But then we're printing on newsprint, and we're printing
Right.
fairly fast,
Very absorbent.
still hand fed. So
How many impressions an hour? How fast are you running?
depends on the operator. We can get up to 3,000 or 4,000 an hour.
Okay.
With a real good operator.
Right.
But usually
Good.
we're running it slow for demonstrations. So
Right.
and we don't want to, if we run too many sheets, then we have big piles of paper. So we run it as slow as
Right.
possible for demonstration purposes. So
Great.
Yeah.
Well, and what are you printing?
we're printing a newspaper, and
Right.
also I think
Oh,
Dory
handset type lino.
yeah, handset and linotype. And I
Okay.
think Dory has some ladies took over the letterpress a couple of years ago,
I can show you.
and they printed a. Okay, well, this is still in black ink. Yeah, they printed a person poster on it using handset type, and so then we started handing those out. But I think I gave her. Do you have a color one?
I do. I'm unrolling it safely. Hang tight.
Yeah, these ladies took over the press, and they took all the color out, and we thought it wouldn't work. We thought the press would leach black ink into the color, but they stripped all it out, and they printed that. And woohoo!
Great.
It was wonderful. But yeah,
Yeah,
real
it's
thin.
beautiful.
Great.
Oil-based ink. So
Great. I mean, a couple other things that'll affect what type of ink you need. Speed of your press, size of your press. Also, the type of form you're printing. Like if you're printing flats or big wood type, you're going to need a little bit looser ink, a little bit longer ink, so you can get it to spread out over those surfaces and those open areas. It's like Chris said, saltiness, right? Saltiness is probably just a little too stiff of ink for saltiness. Another thing though is paper and how well that paper is absorbing the ink or taking the ink. Modeling is often caused by uneven drying, so pigment and binder settling out unevenly or laying out unevenly on your paper. And that could be fixed by remilling and adding some pigment. It might be a little weak, so you get a better coverage.
Can you or Chris describe what saltiness means? Because I'm not familiar with that term, and I don't know what that looks like.
Sure. Chris, do you want to?
Anytime you're printing and you have the texture of the page bleed through the body of the ink, you end up with sort of like a speckled tone on the page.
Ah, okay.
And that's where a lot of times if somebody's working with rubber-based ink or something, they'll hit it 2 or 3 times with the same color to try to cover it. And at the same time, if your ink's too tacky, it's going to keep pulling fiber, so it'll remain salty. But I think we call it salty because it looks almost as though sometimes somebody sprinkled some white salt over the page. Some people call it staticky. Some people just say the ink is pulled the fibers up. But yeah, we usually refer to that as sort of salty or staticky.
Thank you.
Salt and pepper, right? Because if you're doing black,
right,
and you make salt and pepper, you got those spots. And yeah, I think if your ink's a little too stiff for your paper, that's
Yeah.
going to cause that. It's not going to cause as good of a transfer.
Mhm.
More of a model where you're getting variations in color.
Mhm.
That's going to be more of a weak ink, I think, or an improperly milled ink, not milled enough, where the pigment and binder aren't mixed well enough. And you can sometimes see that a lot with metallics, because the metals like to settle out, right?
Mhm.
They just like to settle to the bottom, so you have to keep those mixed up.
A lot of people that want to run a metallic on a darker page, you end up with sort of what we could, in this case call pepper, where it's like the black page or the
Yeah.
brown page or something is going to bleed through as well. And the pigment
Right.
and just shift out and let the page come through a little bit more too. So even with the oil-based inks, you can suffer it depending on what kind of ink you're using, on what color paper, etc. Whether
Right.
it's coated page, uncoated, and things
Right.
too.
So we need to pressure the manufacturers to make a uncoated, coated, and a
Right, different versions.
paper specific. Let's make a crayon ink and a Savoy ink and
I think Michael,
whatever other papers a newsprint ink and a.
I think you've brought up a great point too, is inks have become more commercially manufactured on a massive scale. What we've seen is an economization of the way that the pigments are used. And so they
Yeah.
will put, just like paint companies and other coatings companies, as little pigment in as possible to,
Right.
the standard of it actually being that hue. So you end up with that. When, at my print shop in Buffalo, I had a number of inks that were donated, and somewhere from the 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah.
And all those metallics were 1,000 times stronger than any metallic you could
Right.
get now. So
Right.
there's
Well,
been
I think all colors, really. Like, I see a lot of tints printed these days. Like, a lot of tints printed these days. And I think a lot of it's the ink, and I'll say that the economy of that pigment load, right? How much pigment is being put in. And there's something called tinting strength. So pigment has a tinting strength. So it can actually be diluted so much before it starts to lose its actual color. And ink makers know that, and they do that. They add a filler that's a white up until that point of break for that tinting strength of that pigment. So you end up with trying to mix in, and you end up mixing not just that pure red. It's going to lighten it up as soon as you start to divide it. What's another term related to that? How are we on time? I haven't looked at the clock.
So we have, you're doing great. You have about 10 minutes before we've hit the hour mark.
Okay.
And actually, you've covered a lot that's in your outline.
I've covered a lot.
Yeah, it looks like what you haven't looked at is a mixing of warm and cool.
Oh, okay.
Mixing
A little
that
bit of color mixing.
Yeah.
Let me go over a couple of just definitions, and then we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
So, properties of color. You've got hue, which is on the color wheel. What does it look like, right? Mass tone, that's the color you see in the can. Undertone is what you see when it lays down on the paper and the paper starts to come through. Like if there's transparency, a lot of transparency, you're going to get a lot more undertone than if you've got a more opaque ink. Color strength, how much pigment is in that ink. That's its color strength. Tinting strength is how far you can dilute that pigment before it starts to shift in color. And all of those play a role in mixing things up. And I haven't brought up Pantone. Obviously, I'm interested in another sort of set of colors, right? But it's amazing what they've been able to do and formulate all those different colors and standardize it. Amazing. But I'm shifted more to these earth colors, different palette entirely. But we can talk more about that later. So yeah, when something to know, mixing ink. If you've been in art school, and you sat through. I actually skipped painting class, but I know some beginning painting classes and 2D design classes, they start with color theory, and you just sit there with a brush and you just mix a little of this, a little more, and you make these giant color charts of just mixing paint colors. Those will help you know how to mix ink. But something I noted is don't mix, look at the color temperature of your ink. So if it's a warm colored ink or warm tone versus a cool tone, so like, and don't mix those two. If you do, you'll get a deader color. It'll deaden your color. You lose brilliance, kind of gray it down a little. So stick with like, that's why Pantone has the rubine and the warm red, and is there one more? Yeah. So like
red. Yeah.
Red. They have all those reds because they're warm reds and cool reds to be mixed in with cool blues or warm yellows. There's also warm and cool greens. Be aware of that. So if you've got a green, you might want to make sure you're trying to add warm with warm so that it doesn't dull it down. Unless you want dull colors, and that's fine too. It's something that comes up. If you read a lot of books about printing, they usually always have a section about ink and a little bit about ink mixing, and some have extensive like charts. Mix this color with this color. Use this color and this color combination, and it's kind of interesting to read those. I put it on my bibliography, but also I shared it with Dory. Is Earhart's The Color Printer. Some of you are probably familiar with that book. It's a very, very interesting book, in my opinion, because it goes over all of that. Warm, cold, cool. Use this color combination, that color combination. And they've gone through and like printed every single one. It's fun to look at. I can get a link. It's on the Internet Archive.
You guys haven't seen the bibliography, but Michael put together a really wonderful set of sources for us. So whenever I repost this to the YouTube, in the show notes, I'll include his full bibliography, but props to him and a thank you for putting together those resources.
Fun or helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
One or the other.
I have a question while we have kind of a hive mind, and I think this applies even if you don't do like Pantone color. So I'm mostly mixing ink by hand, and I know we're not talking exclusively about mixing ink. One problem I have is that the color, you know, the saturation and the tone is often very different on my mixing plate versus, you know, what it's actually printed. And I haven't found the best way yet to test that color without actually inking, you know, my whole press. So that becomes a problem, because if it's too dark in tone, even though I'm not trying to exactly match a color, if it's too dark or too light in tone, then I have to wipe all the ink off and effectively start over with that inking process. Have you been able to work out kind of a good process for yourself to be able to preview what that ink mix might look like whenever it's actually
I think there's two good tests for it. One's the tap down test, one's the ink drawdown.
Okay.
So with the tap, you take your finger and just put it in the ink, and then on your paper, I would recommend using the paper you're going to print on, because it varies from paper to paper. You just tap, and you can tap a line or tap it out around, so you get, because what you're going to end up doing is seeing different film thicknesses and densities, and you'll see how that varies as you tap it out.
Okay.
So just tap the ink until it doesn't come off anymore.
So whenever I do that, is the resulting color more likely going to be the first tap or the last tap? Because that's what I haven't been able to figure out.
Probably the middle.
The middle, okay. That's fair.
It depends on how much you put on your press, right?
Yeah.
Another advantage of the tapping test is that it kind of mimics that impression, right?
Mm-hmm.
The drawdown test, you take your ink knife and get ink on the knife. Don't need much at all. And then take a piece of paper on your glass and just draw down the knife. And that'll tend to show undertone a lot. if your ink's, depending on how transparent your ink is.
Yeah,
those are two.
I think that's probably been what I've probably been using most often, because I have a glass palette with a white piece of paper underneath it. So I can, as I'm mixing, I'm trying to kind of pay attention to what that more transparent color is looking like. And I pull some of the, out of the ink pool, if you will, to see what it looks like. But again, I'm not trying to match a color specifically, but I've noticed that's a challenge.
You'll get there. One day someone's gonna say, I need this color.
Yeah. Great. Well, you guys, we're almost at time, but I want to make sure we reserve a few minutes for your questions or feedback or comments that you might have. Anybody have anything to share with Michael?
On the tap down test, one way to do that, Dory, is when you do it, you get a lot of ink on your finger. What I do is I rub it around and then I just rub it all out, and you'll have the tone from the lightest all the way through to about the darkest. And you can kind of, figure out where it is your press might, after a few times, you'll start to get a feeling for how your press covers it compared to how you do the tap out and the rub down. So that might be one technique to use on that.
Thank you, John.
Can I make a comment, Dory?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Anyone who's been printing a really long time knows this, and you probably know it as well, but you should pay mind to how the ink sounds on your press. And if you can create a consistent sound that you become really, really familiar with, in the same way that, like, if you're a bowler or you play darts or something, you have a really consistent throw, that's like how you get there. That's going to help you really create an average ink coverage that you would have, so every time you throw the ink on the press for the work that you're doing, unless there's a ton of surface area to cover or it's really small type, you could work with that same average sound. And that's where I think Michael is making the statement about it's probably going to be in the middle of that. If you can work it out that it's like, your average sort of finger tapping is going to be the average you have on your press, you'll have at least like maybe a starting point.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I had watched a video. So I I have a couple of platen presses, and just picked up a show card that's right next to me that I'm just like hugging at the moment. I'm super excited about it. But I watched a video with Alan over at Excelsior Press, and he recommended kind of a low hissing noise for platen presses. So that's what I've been listening for as I'm inking, to make sure I don't over ink more than necessary. But that's a really great tip. Thank you so much.
Could I add just a note to that?
Yeah.
If you're hand inking, you're also going to get that hiss, but you can look at your ink disc, and you can look at your plate, and you can see the reticulation that's in the ink. And that reticulation that's on your brayer or on your rollers, you're going to get that, you're transferring that same reticulation over to your type. So you want as little of that as you can get.
Okay.
But you do need a full ink film, which I think shorter inks tend to reticulate less than longer inks. Something that kind of blew my mind when I first made ink, it didn't reticulate. I didn't have as much sound, and I was like, I don't even think this is gonna work. But then I got crisper, cleaner prints than I'd ever seen myself make.
Yeah.
I mean, people are making beautiful work every day. It's really great.
That's awesome. Thank you. Any last questions for Michael?
I had a question when we were talking about short inks and long inks, Michael. If you know about this, it's something I've never really had the time to research. I know I'm not a chemist, and that's why you might know more about it, but on a molecular level, when we're talking about that sort of breaking point for a short ink and a long ink, most inks are just particles in suspension, but is there a sort of molecular component that's going on here where, imagine, this is the simplest way to put it, you have a ratio of binder to pigment that would be like 10 to 1. As we stiffen up the ink, maybe we make it 5 to 1, maybe then after that we make it 1 to 1. Is there anything to that where it's like you could have, it could be a molecule to a molecule as opposed to like a chain of molecules? Or
Yes. I mean, as I said earlier, different pigments have different properties and they change the properties of the ink. So it's pigment by pigment that you have to like lay that all out.
right.
I'm sure that someone has. There's something called the iodine value that they use a lot. I'm an artist, not a chemist, right? Or as well. So I'm when it gets into the really technical chemical stuff, I start to get a little lost. Ellis on the bibliography, I think that's from 1940. That's a chemistry book, and that's the first ink chemistry book you see. And that's all he's talking about is all that stuff. But it does, like particle size really affects it a lot. Like an intaglio ink, for traditional intaglio, they usually use a larger particle size because it's easier to wipe clean. But there is a definite relationship between the pigment load, how much pigment is in there, and to binder. And as the pigment load goes up, it gets shorter.
Yeah,
that
makes sense to me.
That's known.
Yeah.
And you mentioned amounts. So typically, like some inks are a 50-50 ratio. So you have your varnish, binder with dryers and additives, and then your pigment. Some mixtures require like a 50-50 mix. Some you can get down to like 20 to 30%, but it's usually in that, I'll say 20 to 60% range. According to the books I've read nowadays, I don't know how much they're adding, but it would be nice to have. I mean, there's other issues, right? With as you lessen the pigment load, your ink gets weak. It's not going to cover as well. So if you've got a lower pigment load and you're trying to get color on the paper, and after splitting and splitting and splitting, it's thin enough to where you're just not getting the color, right? Because you just don't have enough pigment in the ink.
I've been interested in that sort of molecular chemistry aspect of it for a little while, just because we're working with the fluorescence, and it's like,
right,
it's like how they're behaving on a molecular level that gives them their daylight and their UV fluorescence. But then the relationship between the pigment and the binder is it's like still sometimes a mystery to me. I do get to work with the chemist at Dayglow, Tom Diabate, and I might be able to ask him a few questions like that, and then follow up with you guys. I'll shoot him an email and see if he has any insight, even into how just modern ink, whether or not it's always suspension or whether or not there's a molecular bond that occurs between the binder and the pigment.
I think there are some. I mean, there's something called wettability, where that's how well the particles are able to take on and be covered with the binder and varnish. And that definitely has a molecular interaction. And so, yes, I think there is definitely one.
I'll let you guys know if I find anything out too.
Please do. And Christopher, if you find anything, shoot that over and I'll be happy to help circulate. You can send it either to Michael or I, and we'll make sure we get it out to the group.
Great, got it.
Yeah.
Good question. Thank you so much. Any other last questions for Michael? Okay, guys, then we will close our session for the day. Thank you so much, Michael. I've learned more than I thought I ever could about ink, and it's been a real delight. Thank you. That really helped me understand a lot of what I'm experiencing, and I'm sure other people are feeling the same way. So thank you for all of your time and sharing your knowledge.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for everyone who's come. Thank you, Dory, for organizing it.
Yeah, you got it.
This series has been great. I would say do check out the outline I put together if you're interested. I think it has more information, more organized. And if you have any questions at all, I'm here.
Yeah,
Somewhere
thank
you can email or Facebook message or however. what's best for you.
Thank you so much for that. Guys, I'll post this up on the YouTube probably within the next week or so, and we'll make sure to include that bibliography. And then if you need help connecting with Michael, shoot me a message on the calendar request, and I'll be happy to connect you guys. Thank you so much. Have a great day, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cool.